This seems like it's taking a bit longer. Or not. All right, I think we're live.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Really, really nice to see you all here. 58 people are watching. Hi, everyone. Hi. Feel free to say hi in the chat box. I see you guys have already been interacting.
Chatting away.
Yeah. Really good to see you all. Good to see familiar faces, names.
And some new ones too.
Yes, that's fantastic. All right, I think we are ready to start. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Teacher Development is here with yet another fantastic webinar for you guys. Thank you for coming. We hope that you will enjoy today's session, because today's topic is something that we rarely talk about, since the majority of the students here at Novakid are very young learners. As you already know, we're going to be talking about teaching preteens and developing their speaking competencies in particular. How exciting is that? As you know, speaking is one of the main goals for most parents, and whereas with the younger kids, once they get enough vocabulary and grammar structures, it's easier for them to chat away. With the older kids, with preteens, they're more likely to be reluctant to speak, which happens for a number of reasons. And today we're going to cover some of those reasons and also possible ways of how you can encourage them to speak more. Get comfortable, because today we will answer all your questions. Brittany here is going to give us lots of practical tips. Those of you who are watching us for the first time, let me quickly introduce our amazing host, Brittany. She's been teaching ESL and doing teacher training for over 10 years, and she's now with Novakid family and is always eager to share her experience with you guys. Please welcome Brittany. Hi, Brittany.
All right. Thank you so much, Elena, for such a warm welcome. And as Elena mentioned, it's really nice to see so many familiar names and some new ones too. And I'm really excited about this webinar. This webinar is a little bit different from maybe our past webinars in that we'll be focusing on speaking rather than on grammar or vocabulary. And this webinar too is also going to ask you a lot of different questions. I'm a firm believer that teaching is a big community profession, and we should always be learning from each other, not just from one or two different people, but we all have a wealth of information that I really believe we should be sharing. So today we'll be sharing a lot of ideas throughout the webinar and especially towards the end. So I'm going to share our presentation with you now, and you should be able to see it now on your screen. So today we will be talking about developing speaking skills in our preteen and teen students. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. We will start by talking about your typical teen student, what they're like, how they act, and maybe a little bit about what's going on in their lives at the moment. We'll talk about teaching speaking. Why do we do it? And what are some key components of speaking? We'll look at motivation and engagement, as well as some strategies for teaching these preteen students. We'll take a look at the Novakid specific courses, what's available to our students, and a little bit about why some students might take these courses over other students or other courses. We'll look at more teaching tips for developing speaking skills. We will be using specific Novakid slides, but don't worry. If you're not a Novakid teacher, you can still pull out the strategies that we'll be talking about today. Finally, we'll finish with a short Q&A at the end. Let's start by talking about your typical preteen student. Now, if you've attended some of our webinars in the past, you're probably familiar with the developmental stages and the things that your students are experiencing at this time. We have looked in the past about very young learners, our older learners, and our preteen students. But there are some specific things that apply to our preteen students that don't necessarily apply to our younger students. So to get the ball rolling and to warm up a little bit, we have a short activity that Elena is going to introduce to you now.
Thank you very much, Brittany. All right, guys. As you can see, there's a QR code on the screen. That means it's time for you to grab your phones, scan it, and access Menti platform, where you will get access to a very simple question, actually. Let me share my screen. Those of you who are not able to scan the code, please feel free to follow the link in the chat box that our moderator should be sending you now. Let's wait for a couple more seconds for people to join the platform. I see some hearts are popping up. Good to see you joining. All right. Okay, a couple more seconds. And now you're going to see the question. So we will think, what characteristic features can you find in your typical preteen student? Think about the way they act during the lessons. Think about the way they respond to different activities in their English classes. Think about their general attitudes or moods. I see somebody already answered unfocused, shy, distracted. That is true. Bored, might happen. Moody, absolutely, we've all been there. Distracted, using their phone. Less motivated. That is also true. If we compare them to our younger ones, uninterested, talkative, that would be ideal for our purpose for today. Yeah, sensitive, difficult, good reader, also true.
And I think it's important too, sorry to cut you off, Elena. I think it's important too to mention that the majority of these students have experienced some English lessons, formal English education of some type, whether it be in their kindergartens or their schools, or perhaps they have someone at home that speaks English. But as some of you have mentioned with your words, that these students can sometimes be a little bit demotivated. And I think that has a little bit to do with the education systems in certain countries and them not being focused on the communicative approach. So sometimes, if you think back to even your own language learning in school, I remember conjugating verbs in French for months on end, rather than speaking. Can I speak French today? No, not a chance. But I did take 12 years of French. So I think it's important to realize that behind all of this, their motivation is a little bit different, and they might get demotivated a little easier than your younger students.
I totally agree. And I can also relate to sometimes being demotivated in my English learning experience back in the days. I can see that you guys have submitted a lot of great ideas and thoughts on characteristic features of our preteen students. I think that paints a good picture of what we deal with here. And I'm going to save this wonderful word cloud, our collective mind, and pass it back to Brittany to continue with our presentation for today. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you, Elena. This is one of my favorite activities every time. I just love the word cloud. And I think I've probably said this every webinar that we've done this, but the word cloud is always, it's so cool to just see everybody's ideas come together when everybody's sharing their ideas. But getting back to our preteen students, our students definitely have some reasons not to want to speak English. And we've talked about their lower motivation or the fact that they are bored. But it's also important to get to the root of that. Why? Why do you think some of your students are reluctant to speak English during class? Why do you think they are demotivated? Let's this time use the chat box and put in some answers there. Why might your students be reluctant to speak? Maybe they have different interests. Maybe they don't think that English is useful to them. How or why might they not want to speak during their lessons?
I think answering that question, we can also put ourselves into their shoes and remember us being that age, being asked to do something that perhaps we're not so inclined to do, learning foreign languages, uninterested. They don't feel confident enough to speak English. That is true. Confidence is an important factor. And as Brittany mentioned, in lots of public schools, perhaps the confidence is compromised by very strict rules and different kind of methodology.
Definitely.
Scared to make a mistake. Absolutely.
These are all great answers. Let's take a look at some answers that we've put together. It's easier to explain things in my own language because I don't know the words in English. I'm sure if you teach preteen students, you may have asked them a question and they just look at you and they think, I don't know how to explain it in English, or I know how to say it in Polish, but they don't know how to explain it. And that brings up this reluctance to speak. Perhaps also the teacher always corrects me when I say something wrong and I don't want to make a mistake. Your preteen students want to be included. They want to feel like they're doing the right thing. They want to be accepted. And this is a big thing that happens around this age, is this feeling or need to be accepted. And they don't want to let anyone down. They don't want to make mistakes. So this might also be why they're reluctant to speak. Perhaps it's not cool to speak English. This again goes back to being accepted. Maybe their friends don't speak English. Maybe their friends told them it's not cool to speak English. And this will also bring in their own reluctance to speak. Perhaps they have no reason to learn English. So why try to speak it? It's a waste of time for them. This goes into also not wanting to practice English because the people around them don't speak English. The people around them speak their language. It's also important to remember that at this age, your students are very within themselves. They're very egotistical in which that they're trying to come into their own person. They're trying to push boundaries, see who they're going to become, and they don't have that forward thinking. They don't know that English is going to help them in the future. It's just something that affects them right now that they might not be into. But you might think that just because your student has made up their mind means that you can't change it. But if you know the root cause of why your student is reluctant to speak English, you'll be able to get around that and encourage them to speak in the classroom, bring in their interests, and help them find this love for English that we all have. Because as we all know, speaking English is really, really important. But why? Why is it important to speak English? And why is it important to develop these speaking skills in our students? If you think about your students and where they're going to be going in the future, in a lot of different countries, students will need to take exams. They will be taking formal exams, usually formal English exams, to get into university, maybe to get a job. And speaking is one of the 4 core skills that they need to develop. Along with their reading, their writing, and their listening, students will also be graded on their speaking skills. So it's really important for us to help them realize how important developing these speaking skills really are, because they're going to use them in the future. But speaking is a really big topic. It's not just the words that come out of your mouth, as I'm sure we all know. But what exactly encompasses speaking skills? We've put together a little activity of the key components of speaking. Now, these are not all of the components because there are too many of them. But take a look at the key components that we've placed on the screen and see if you can guess what some of them are. Don't worry if you don't know all of them. Some of them are a little difficult. Put in 1 or 2 or 3 Try to guess what the key components are and why they might be important. And you can write your answers in the chat box.
I can already see how fast you guys are reacting. You are so good at this exercise. It always amazes me. Pronunciation. I think, am I right? Stephen was the first one with pronunciation. Congratulations. Sentence structure and grammar. Stephanie, good job.
The last one I think is the most difficult.
Usage of vocabulary. Everybody guessed that. I see Charvi. Correct me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Sorry in advance. Has put all the words in one message. Well done. Pronunciation, stress and intonation, usage of vocabulary, sentence structure and grammar.
So as I'm pretty sure everybody put in, our first one is pronunciation. After pronunciation, we have stress and intonation, usage of vocabulary, sentence structure and grammar, fluency, and as I think I saw just now, volume and voice tone. Now, of course, there are way more components of speaking, but these ones are really important for you to be teaching to your students during class. So before we go into the courses that are available at Novakid for our students, let's take a look at some general strategies for teaching preteens. And these strategies are going to help you motivate and engage your students. We're going to put them into three categories, the three big strategies. The first one is to reassure your student that making mistakes is okay. If you've ever tried to learn a language yourself, you'll know that it's really demotivating to feel like you're always making the same mistake over and over again, especially if you're constantly being corrected. You want to feel like you are making improvements in your language skills. And the only way to make improvements is to make those mistakes. Sometimes it's really hard for your students to feel confident, to speak and to try, but this is something that will really motivate them when they know that it's okay to say whatever they want to say and that you will help guide them in maybe a gentle way if your student needs that, but in a way that's reassuring to them. Next, we have praise and positive reinforcement. Now, you might think that your teenage students and your preteen students don't care about praise, but trust me, they really do. In fact, even as an adult, I like being praised. And I'm sure we can all agree that it feels good to be recognized for something you've done well. It is important, though, to make sure that your praise and your rewards are age appropriate for your students. Whereas with your younger students and in the lower levels, you might put on a Manicam mask or you might have your Mickey Mouse ears. That's perfectly fine. It's important to remember that maybe with your preteen students, that won't go over as well. You want to keep your rewards age appropriate for them. This doesn't mean that if they did something fantastic and amazing and you just can't control how proud you are of them, that you forget that and you do something crazy. I've done that too. I've high-fived some of my older students. I've brought out a party whistle and blown it at your birthday. There are these things that you can do. And I think by doing them only once or twice, my students get this more immense sense of pride that their teacher is so impressed with what they've done. But I would say not to use these as much. Try to keep your praise more age appropriate for your students. And finally, don't interrupt your students when speaking. Not only is this rude, but it's also demotivating for your students if they're being cut off or they're being interrupted when they're trying to say or trying to communicate with you. So let's take a look now at the speaking courses that Novakid offers. Now, if you are not a Novakid teacher, it's okay. But if you are a Novakid teacher, I really hope that you are aware of or you have taught at least one of these speaking courses, but please put them in the chat. What speaking courses do we have for our students at Novakid?
And we have the first one, Francesca, Time to Talk. Yes. Yes, Time to Talk is one of our speaking courses. VR or virtual lessons, good one. Virtual Explorer, that is the correct name of our speaking course.
Very good. Well, okay, so we do have two courses. We're going to look at them individually first, starting with Time to Talk. Now, Time to Talk is geared more towards our A2 to B1 students on the CEFR, and it's either as a complement to the general course or after they finish their general courses. You might have some students that take 2 general English courses or 1 general English course every week, and they take Time to Talk at the same time. The grammar and the vocabulary within the Time to Talk course does fall in line with levels 3 and 4. And it's to engage our more advanced learners. Perhaps you have learners that aren't at Novakid for general English, but they're coming in for a speaking supplement. They might be in this Time to Talk course. Now, along with Time to Talk, we have our second speaking course that I saw many of you mention, which is the Virtual Explorer course. The Virtual Explorer course is our highest level course, and it's geared more towards B1 or B1 plus students. These are for students that have covered every single level that we have here at Novakid, and they still want to continue learning. And this is also for students that might find level 4 or the Time to Talk curriculum too easy. So these courses are very similar in some regards, but this is how they are different. You can see here that Time to Talk is a little bit easier, whereas Virtual Explorer is for a student who has completed everything and is ready to really be pushed to learn more. That being said, there are some similarities between the two courses. First of all, they are not recommended for students who are struggling with the general course curriculum. If you have a level 3 student or a level 4 student who is still getting assigned extra practice or still needs more reinforcement, this is not the course for them. It would be better for them to finish level 3 and level 4 before starting Time to Talk. Let them build that groundwork before moving on to the speaking courses. Each of these lessons has a different topical theme. There's different target language, and there are different communicative language aims. In the Time to Talk curriculum, there are 40 different lessons, and last I checked, there were about 80 different lessons in the Virtual Explorer. The Time to Talk curriculum is considered to be completed, I believe. Elena, correct me if I'm wrong.
That is correct.
Whereas the Virtual Explorer course is having new lessons added every month. So there could be 80 lessons in Virtual Explorer now or more, but every month there are more lessons added.
But they've been added regularly. That is true.
But each one is on a different topic. So your student might learn about the animal kingdom, one lesson, and the next lesson be learning about the age of discovery. Or maybe they're learning about the water cycle. So these courses, these lessons are a lot more engaging in the fact that every lesson is different. Finally, all of these lessons include discussions, role play, and debates. And these help learn the language in an authentic manner. They aren't doing gap fill activities that they would be doing in the general English. They aren't doing the presentation, practice, production. It's more of a speaking through the different topics that they are doing. So they are a little bit different, but they are a little bit the same as well. Another way that they're different, not from each other, but from general English lessons, is our correction techniques. Now, again, if you've come to some of our previous webinars, you're probably aware of the different correction techniques that we mentioned with skipped correction, delayed correction, or immediate correction. And it is true that you will use these kinds of correction techniques in your speaking courses, but what you choose to correct is a little bit different. There are three main errors that you'll try to correct in your speaking courses. The first one being a target language error. As I just mentioned, each lesson has a different target language topic. And if your student is speaking and they make an error related to something that they've just learned, it might be important to correct it right away because it shows that they haven't learned the target language correctly. So we do want to make sure that they are using their new vocabulary correctly within the course. The next type of correction is a communication error. Because this is a speaking course, it is important to let your student talk. If you notice that they make a communication error that doesn't hinder the message that they're trying to send, it might be useful to just ignore it for right now. You can make a note of it, and then later, if it's still important, you can bring it up as a correction. However, if your student is talking and they make an error that really does hinder the message that they're trying to send, it is important to correct it right away because we want our students to be speaking in a fluent manner in which they are being understood. Finally, a single repeated error. This could be something as simple as forgetting your articles or forgetting the S on the third person form. But if it's happening once or twice, you might want to skip that correction. But if it is happening over and over again, it's really important to correct it on the spot. Because if you ignore it, your student's not going to realize that anything is wrong, and they're going to continue to make this error over and over again. So it is important with a single repeated error to correct it right away. Now that we've talked about correction techniques and we've talked about the courses that are offered, we're going to come into the more interactive portion of our webinar in which we're going to look at more teaching tips for developing speaking skills. And these teaching tips will surround small talk, smooth transitions, pre-teaching vocabulary, reading, grammar, and time management. And for each of these tips, I'm going to ask you for your own input as well. I want to get more information about how I can be a better teacher as well. And I'm sure your fellow teachers in the chat will appreciate your responses. So don't be shy. Our first teaching tip is on the topic of small talk. It doesn't matter if it is a time to talk course, like you can see on the left, or a virtual explorer course that you can see on the right. Each lesson starts with 3 or 4 questions to engage the student and to set the tone for the lesson. You want to gather a little background knowledge, see how your student feels about it, but it doesn't matter if it's time to talk or virtual explorer. Each lesson is going to have a small talk as a warm-up. But as I'm sure you can see here, they're not quite the same. And my first question to you is, what similarities and differences do you see between the two courses when it comes to small talk? So don't be shy, put your answers in the chat.
Yes, come on guys, it's a safe space to share your ideas. Right, Benita? There are pictures on the left. Exactly. They both have open-ended questions. Good, Angela. The time to talk lesson provides them with some sentence structure that they can make use of. Precisely, Stephen.
Fantastic. And this is exactly right. If you look at your time to talk lessons, there are usually scaffolded or modeled sentences for your students. Whenever there's a question asked, there's usually the sentence starter for them. And this is great because if you remember, the time to talk course is geared a little bit lower than the Virtual Explorer course. Now, if you've taught any Virtual Explorer lessons, you'll know that these sentence starters don't exist. If your student needs them, it's totally okay to write them on the screen or to use the little keyboard pull down feature to give them that extra support. But I do think that the Virtual Explorer is geared a little bit more towards higher students, as we've mentioned. So there are a few less pictures, and there are less sentence starters. Well done, everyone. Okay, let's move on to our next tip. Smooth transitions. Smooth transitions are super important, and the way that you move from one slide to the other helps keep your students focused and engaged in the lesson. And it's also a great way to connect everything together. But the way that you transition from one slide to the other depends on what the next information is. So if you're on your warm-up slide and you're going to be transitioning to a picture, you want to try and make your warm-up questions lead into that picture. You don't want to have these just, oh, let's look, or let's go. You want to have some sort of phrase. Maybe ask your student what they can see. But here is your next opportunity to give some more insight. Here you have a description of elephants, the largest animal on land. And the next slide is going to be a VR slide. So this is the slide where they can move everything around and they can explore the area. So my question now is, what transitional phrase or words would you use to make that smooth transition from a reading text to the VR slide?
Let's see how you would transition. Imagine we're your students and you need to introduce the next slide. I usually ask them if they want to see the elephants. Intriguing. Have you seen an elephant before? Would you like to see elephants in the wild? Those are all great. Let's have a look at some examples of elephants in the wild. Would you love to see elephants in their natural habitat? Good one, Veronica.
Now, if you haven't previewed your lessons, which I don't recommend, but if you don't know what slide is coming, you can always scroll down to the bottom of your screen. So that'll give you a little bit of an insight about what the next slide is. So I know it happens, we're rushed, we don't have time to go through the lesson. If you do scroll down, you can see what's coming next, and that might help you with your transitions. But these are all great answers.
Can I just say, I love the one Gary just posted. I will say, let us take a trip to Africa and see the elephants.
Oh, that's great. Because Virtual Explorer, we want our students to feel like they're getting out in the world and exploring and going to different places. Okay.
Exactly.
Let's look at our next tip, which is pre-teaching vocabulary. Now, if your students are in Virtual Explorer, especially, but also in Time to Talk, we do expect our students to be a little more advanced than their general English courses. That's not to say that they're going to know every word on the slide, because we still want our students to be learning new vocabulary through these new courses and these new lessons. Now, some of these words will be highlighted in the screen, but it's important to be able to pre-teach the vocabulary to your students before they read it. First, you should always preview your lesson, especially if you've never taught that lesson before. Even if you have, there are changes all the time. There was a lesson I taught the other day that I've probably taught 10 times, and I went through it and I was like, this is a new slide. And that's not something you should be doing. So make sure you're always previewing your lessons before you teach them. While you're previewing your lessons, pick out those words and anticipate the ones that you think your students are going to struggle with. And think about how you're going to elicit and ask CCQs to help them with their understanding. Before they read, elicit those answers from them. And ask follow-up questions to make sure that they've understood. Some of these slides, like I just mentioned, will have words highlighted. These are words that the content team feels that the student will struggle with. But if you look at the slide on the right, there are no highlighted words. Do I expect my student to know all of these words? Probably not. So my next question to you is, what words would you consider pre-teaching from these two slides? Try to only choose 3 or 5 words. that you would consider pre-teaching, and write them in the chat. Now, because these are words that you'd be pre-teaching, and because I haven't given you any time to prepare, I'm not going to ask you how you would pre-teach them, but I do think it's important to be able to pick out the words that you think your student would struggle with.
And it might not be the words exactly, it might be some word phrases. I see some posted already: fossils, galaxy, Milky Way, mysteries, behavior, cluster, detectives. I mainly pre-teach pronunciation and meaning. Yes, that's always a good idea, Lauren. Cluster, spinning, evolution, observe, yeah.
Now, I think it's also important to mention that when you're pre-teaching vocabulary, one of the big things you can do to help your students in a way that you can elicit is by asking them to see what words they can see within the word that you're trying to pre-teach. This is also an excellent way to teach them about word families. So if they look at the word evolution, what words can you see in evolution? Maybe they can see evolve. Maybe they don't know the word evolution, but they know the word evolve. And from that, they'll be able to gather their own information, which will lead to higher retention. Learning about word formation and word families is also super important for your students, especially again, if they're going to be taking exams later on. But these are all great examples of words that your students might struggle with and need to be taught before they're read. Okay, let's move on to our next tip, which is reading and beyond. We do want our students to be proficient readers. We also want to pull on their background information. After reading a text, don't rush to the next slide, especially if there are no questions on the slide. Some slides with reading will have follow-up questions to see if your student has understood what they've read. But if they don't have questions, don't let this deter you. You want your students to be making a connection to what they're reading. It might be a superficial connection, or it might be something where they're able to tell you a story of when they've done some sort of activity, or maybe they wanted to be a paleontologist. Try to find those connections, even if there are no questions available to you. So, after reading this slide with your student, what question are you going to ask them to make that connection and to see if they have background knowledge about these things? It could be something simple. It could be something related to winter. If your student lives in Malaysia, they've probably never ice skated, but how will you make that connection? Because remember, this is a speaking course, so we do want them to be speaking even after they've done a reading activity.
We've got one from Francesca. What do you think of ice skating? How often do you experience this? Are there any of these activities you want or have tried? From Benita. Do you love snow? That's a good one.
I do not love snow.
What is the difference between, yeah, me neither. What is the difference between figure skating and speed skating? Good one. More of an open-ended question. Also encourage a student to speak a little bit more. Which one would you like to try?
Oh, I do like that comment by having your students circle the activity.
Yeah, I was just going to also comment from Lauren. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic, which is grammar. Now, I know I mentioned at the beginning that we are talking about speaking today, but inevitably, grammar is going to creep into that as well. And as we've also spoken about, some of your students won't have completed level 3 or 4, before they come to the Time to Talk or the Virtual Explorer courses. And sometimes there's grammar within that lesson that your student will be expected to use, because each lesson covers a different grammar topic. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to make sure that your student is able to use the grammar correctly, even if they haven't learned it yet? Now, if you have not taught levels 3 and 4 yourself, and you aren't familiar with the grammar topics that are taught, it is really important that you make yourself familiar with them. So for example, I can tell you that using as expensive as is a grammar topic taught in level 4, unit 4. Now, in level 3, they would only have used simple comparatives as more expensive or the most expensive. So this is a little bit of a higher grammar topic, but it's also one slide in a speaking course. Are you going to teach the grammar to your student? Or how can you help your student use the grammar correctly without going off on a tangent for 5 or 10 minutes trying to explain this grammar topic? Let's see. If we have any answers.
Not yet. I give examples. Give an example of what you expect. Yes, modeling is a good idea. I always use Manicam to show them what I mean. Give examples and let them follow the sentence pattern. I use a whiteboard or Realia, TPR, with a smile.
And a smile. I love the smile. Gary, that
Don't
smile is
forget the
key.
smile. Yeah, smile goes a long way.
So these are all really great answers, and there is no real correct answer. You will have students that are capable of learning this grammar topic in a minute or in 2 minutes, and it might be worth it to you to go to a blank slide and give them a mini grammar lesson. Again, it depends on whether or not you are familiar with how to teach it yourself. If you're not, and again, remembering that this is maybe only 1 or 2 slides, maybe you'll just write a line. Maybe you'll draw a line through the red hat and the purple hat, and you'll help your student make their own sentences using the different things that are available to them. All right, let's go to our next tip, which is time management. If you have taught a Virtual Explorer course, you will know that there is a lot of reading, and sometimes it can feel impossible to complete everything that is within the slides. You might have 3 or 4 pages that have this much writing on them. This is an extreme example. This is probably the most writing I've seen on a single slide. Most of them do not have this much writing. But it is important that you are covering the main lesson objectives within the lesson. So let's say, for example, this is your 3rd slide with reading on it, and you're running out of time, and you're not sure how you're going to complete everything. What are you going to do? How will you cover the information on this slide while also trying to complete all of the material within the lesson within your 25 minutes? So what tips and tricks do you have for time management when you realize it's running out?
That is a lot of text.
It really is.
Yeah,
and again, this is probably the most text. Like, this is an extreme example, but it is my favorite example.
It's good to be prepared. They get scared when they see these long paragraphs. What should we do, Elena and Brittany? Well, you guys, let us know. What would you do? Then we can come up with a perfect solution collectively. Ask the student to match the words to the correct blocks without having them read the texts. Have turns to read. I'll choose the most important parts. This is a follow-up assignment task to fulfill later.
Okay, these are all great suggestions.
I would highlight
And
some
again,
important parts.
there isn't really the right answer, but these are all great things that I think are important to try and implement to make up for that time that you might not have. Now, something that I really like to do with my students is teach them a new skill. I teach them how to skim and scan. So skimming and scanning, again, going back to their external exams that they might be preparing for, is a super important task for them to learn how to do. So I tell my student, you have 20 seconds to read in your head. Because at this point, they have already read probably 3 or 4 texts, and those long paragraphs can be intimidating. And maybe your student isn't a strong reader. So I tell them they have 20 seconds to skim the text. Maybe your student will only read 2 of those texts. It's okay. And the first time your student does this, they're probably going to be terrible at it. But this is something that they need to develop as a skill because it's something we all do anyway. We all know the skill of skimming a text or scanning a text and pulling out information. After that time, it might actually be 20 seconds. I might give them a little more time if I know that they're very, very in the moment trying to read. After that, I'm going to ask them what ride they want to go on. I might not make them order all 5 rides because I don't expect them to have read all of it. But at this point, I do think that they'll be able to have read at least 1 or 2. Which ride do you want to go on and why? They're still speaking. I've cut down an activity that might take a full 5 minutes for one slide into maybe 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes. And they're still learning a new skill. And if they totally blank, they can see the bold words, they can see the italicized words, and they can pull out that information. And at the end of the day, that's what I wanted them to do. I wanted them to skim it. I wanted them to pull out only the important information. And remembering that it's a speaking course, they were able to give me an answer. Again, when your students first learn how to do this, it might not go over very well, and that's okay. I did it for the first time last Friday with one of my new students. She just looked at me like, how do you expect me to do this? Because it's a skill. And it's a skill that they will learn and that they'll get better at the more they do it. All right, let's go on to our next tip, which is the lesson summary slide. This is a slide that's in every Time to Talk course. And it's a slide that's great for your students because they're learning how to make a presentation. Before assigning your student the 1 minute to talk, it's really important that you review what you've talked about throughout the lesson. So in this lesson, we've talked about prepositions of place. We've talked about why you go to certain places. You talk about if there's one in their town. There are a lot of things that they talk about using different places around town. Then I'm going to give my student 1 minute to speak. I'm going to set a timer on my phone so that they can see how much time they have left, because I do want them to fill that time. I want them to find a way to speak for a full minute about whatever topic they've chosen. And if they decide to change the topic halfway through, that's fine too, because they're still talking. Now, my question is, aside from giving them input on what they said specifically, what other skills could we try to build during this lesson summary? Not necessarily with prepositions, not necessarily with where they are in town, but what other things or what other input can you give your students? What other things and feedback are important to incorporate into this lesson summary?
What
other skills? Vocabulary.
Can hear
That's
the
my dog.
Yeah.
He's very upset.
Just saying hi to everybody in the chat.
We live at the end of a dead end. Like, you should be okay. Confidence. Ooh, I like that answer. Confidence is great. Like how to help your student be more confident when they're speaking.
Fluency, grammar, wrap-up skills,
Mhm.
speaking in complete sentences and following instructions,
That's very
time
important.
management.
I learned from a 10-year-old student, if you speak slowly, you can say less. That reminds me of in university when you write a paper and then you make all of the full stops like two sizes bigger so that it fills up an extra page.
Yeah,
I may
that's
or
a
may not have
skill.
done that. It's a skill, right?
Being able to
So,
summarize. Good.
fantastic. So, in addition to these, I also think it's important to teach them signposting language. And it's also important for them to be able to use the sequencing adverbs. First, I'm going to talk about this. Now let's talk about this. Then finally, so that they can organize their ideas. Oh my gosh, what is happening at my house today? I am so sorry. So,
Okay.
and then I also write these things into feedback. So in my feedback, I'll write something like, oh, I noticed that you use sequencing adverbs. That's great. Also remember to use a variety of sequencing adverbs. And maybe I'll give them some more examples so that they can bring that in. And most of the time, the next time we do a slide like this, they remember and they get better every time. Let's look at our next tip, which is pronunciation. Now, sometimes you'll have a slide that looks like this, where a student is going to learn some words and match them to definitions before they actually use them within an activity or a reading activity. Here you can see 4 different words, but it's really important because these are probably words your student hasn't seen before. It's probably something that they're not familiar with. It's really important that they learn how to pronounce these words correctly right away. So, how are you going to teach the proper pronunciation of these words? Are you going to drill them? Maybe you have another strategy. How can you help your students pronounce new words correctly within these lessons?
Model, then drill. Got the first one. Okay, good. Any other strategies you would use? Natasha says breaking the word up, blending.
Using syllables with my hand.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I like to clap syllables sometimes. I also like to write maybe a dash under the syllable that's stressed, because certain languages, when you're learning them, they always stress the second last syllable. So it's easy to remember which syllable is stressed, but English isn't like that. So it can be more difficult for your students. You can also use this as an opportunity, again, to talk about your different word families and word formation when they're trying to match it to the correct definition.
Erna says, I will use phonetic alphabet next to the word. You'd be lucky if the student can read the phonetic alphabet. I think some students who do more traditional English learning in schools might be able to recognize those symbols, but if anything, you can also use the pencil tool to, as you guys mentioned, split it into syllables, or as Brittany mentioned, accentuate the stress.
I'm really impressed, though, that you know the entire phonetic alphabet and are able to just write it on the screen, because I wish I had enough knowledge of it. I always use like the dictionary after class, because I do include some of the IPA alphabet into my feedback sometimes, because I know that because it's international, if my parent wants to look up that word, the symbol will carry over. But I don't know if I would know how to do it in class to like.
I like that. Sorry to interrupt. I like that Adriana said, remember the magic E. That is actually a very good trick, because half of these words have that magic E.
They really do. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a
Like
great
word
tip too.
associations.
That's great too. Okay. All right. Well, we are just about out of time, which is okay because this is our last tip that we were going to talk about. So let's move now into our Q&A. Thank you all so much for participating and sharing your thoughts. And there's definitely some things that I'm going to be taking into my classes now tomorrow when I have my Virtual Explorer student. And please, if there are any questions, put them into the chat. We also have our moderator who's amazing, who has been gathering your questions throughout today's webinar.
Yeah, shout out to Lisa.
She's amazing.
Yay. And I've already got some questions to follow up with. So the first one is from Stephen. I inherited a student who is quite far along with his time to talk lessons, but he really struggles to correctly structure sentences with the correct grammar. How far do I go in correcting his speech?
I think it goes back to, is it a communicative error? So is his speech impeding what he's trying to say? It's also, we don't want to demotivate your students. So maybe if you know that after a couple of these lessons that he has a consistent repeated error of forgetting his third person S, maybe each lesson choose one of those errors and have that be the focus. Maybe don't worry so much about the grammar topic that's within the lesson, but focus on that one error. Because if you've taught this student through a lot of the time to talk lesson, you're probably familiar with the things they need to work on, or incorporate that into the lesson as you go. But it's a little bit tricky, especially if the student has already completed the levels 3 and 4.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also always recommend your student take the extra grammar practice. So if you go through the curriculum page in the portal, you'll be able to find out which level or which unit the student is struggling with. And you can always ask teacher ops to help assign extra grammar, which will help you to bridge that gap, especially if they've already taken level 3 and 4, maybe they need that little refresher. But
Right.
teacher ops is super helpful. Mention they can
Yes,
help
we
you.
are. Then next question is from Sue. I have a student who will not answer any question. I think she can speak fine, but she's just shy. I think we've all been there, and it mostly has something to do with her motivation to speak. Brittany, do you have any tips on how to encourage the girl to?
That's a hard one. I first, if it's her first or second class, it's completely understandable. Like if you are their new teacher and she's not used to the way that you teach or what your expectations are, then it's completely understandable that she doesn't want to speak. She also might be nervous and not know exactly how to speak. So in that, maybe I would give her more autonomy. I would help her be the teacher. So on that warm-up slide, I might circle one of the questions and I might have her ask me that first, so that she's already got the reading. She doesn't have to produce anything independently yet, but she'll be asking me the question. And then I will model the answer for her. Later on, hopefully I'll be able to ask her some similar questions and have her give me her answers. But sometimes these students need a little bit extra scaffolding and modeling so that they get that encouragement and they get, they're able to speak afterwards.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a hard situation. And if you've had the student for a long time, if they are able to do things or not. So I push some of my students who I've had for a long time, who are now getting to that, I don't know how to say it in English phase. I say, okay, where do you do this? What can you see there? And I ask them all the questions around it. And eventually they realize that it's just easier for them to try to explain it to me than to answer all of my extra questions. So by taking a step down and giving them that scaffolding they need, hopefully they'll gain that encouragement and that confidence to speak.
They have no choice, basically, at this point. when they're being bombarded with questions. But it really should help. Another question is, how do we know if our student is doing level 4 and level 5 together? Are the level 5 lessons generally taught exclusively by a separate teacher, or would we just know when teaching different lessons? Generally, students tend to take classes with the same teacher if they're doing two courses in parallel. But I believe that it is possible that due to maybe scheduling conflict, they will have two different teachers. One is teaching them the general course, and the other one is teaching time to talk. But I guess if there are two different teachers, there's a chance that you might not know that the student is taking that other course. That is true.
You should
But
be able to see the feedback.
Yeah, the feedback from the previous class. But they might take 2 classes of general course a week and then one of time to talk.
Mm-hmm. I think the only exception would be if your student is taking level 4 and Virtual Explorer at the same time, because then they have a different account. So if you have any Virtual Explorer students, it always says like the student's name and then VE beside it. So they could
they're
be
marked with a time to talk as well. Time to talk, they also have a separate mark. But yeah, generally they tend to have the same teacher. They prefer to stay with the same teacher, but it might happen that, yeah, they're separate. Benita asks, do you guys always complete all the slides? And I saw a bit of a discussion in the chat box that it's often really hard to follow through with all the slides content. What advice do you have on that, Brittany?
So for time to talk, I don't have a problem finishing the slides. I would say that time to talk, most of my time to talk students are students that have completed levels 3 and 4. So by the time they get to time to talk, they are ready for it. So if anything, I need to extend more in the time to talk courses. That's not quite the same with the Virtual Explorer course. There's a lot of information there. But I will say that when the Virtual Explorer courses were first released, there was a lot more in them than there are now. So I've taught the first 5 lessons of Virtual Explorer to 4 different students at this point. And the lesson that I taught to that first student is not the same. Well, it's the same lesson, but it doesn't have as much content. So the content team knows that there's a lot going on in those slides, and they are making those changes as needed. Now, it is true that sometimes it's a little bit impossible to complete everything in the Virtual Explorer slides. Again, this goes back to needing to preview your lessons. If I know that my student reads a little bit slower, or they love to talk and I don't think I'm going to get through it, it's really important to make sure you look to see if there's a summary slide. So if there's a summary slide that uses relative pronouns, or it's like a quiz or something, it's really important that you touch on the slides that are mentioned in the quiz. So from that, you can see where maybe you can jump a slide, or if they're going to 4 different countries within the one lesson, maybe you only have time for 3 of those countries. But make sure again that you go through the ones that are going to go through the quiz. If not, you're going to get to the quiz and your student's going to be like, we didn't learn about this. So do your best to get through it, but it is completely understandable that sometimes you're not going to get through everything. Now, if you don't get through 50% of it, then you might want to consider redoing the lesson. And the next time, your student can do the second half. And then at the end of the second lesson, it can just be like a nice review of both of them. Because if your student reads slowly, it is quite possible that you won't be able to get through all the reading. It's also okay if you read once in a while and have your student follow along. So hopefully that helps. There are a lot of these lessons.
I see that we have a lot of questions related to similar topics. So guys, forgive me if I skip some of them, but we will definitely address the most frequently asked ones as always on our teacher portal. And for now, I think we're going to wrap up our Q&A session as we're running out of time a little bit, but let us say thank you so much for attending. You're going to see a feedback form in the chat box right about now. So please feel free to fill it out. I would also like to mention that if you fill out the feedback form, there's going to be 2 sections this time. And if you would like to get a certificate of attendance after this webinar, yay! Please answer a few questions in the second section of the feedback form, and we will mail you the certificate of attendance next week. This is very exciting, and we're really happy that you guys are attending our webinars. It's always so nice to spend this hour or an hour and a half with you. Always good to see so much inspiration in the comments, and the interest in teaching and the exchange of ideas. I think this is all very, very helpful for all of us. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to Brittany, as always, fantastic host and excellent teacher. Thank you so much for all of your insights.
I learn a lot every time too. And I really appreciate everyone who's taken the time, especially after all of your lessons today, to come and spend this time and share information. It's also really important that we thank everyone in Teacher Ops that makes this possible, because I think we can all agree that they are all super supportive and they are really helpful for any questions that we have. And the amount of work that goes into each of these webinars is not limited to myself and Elena. There are a lot of people. We have our moderators and we have other people behind the scenes. So we should be very thankful for all of them as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words, Brittany. Always a pleasure to work with you guys. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, wherever you guys are. Have a great one, and we will see you in the upcoming webinars. Yeah, stay tuned. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody. Bye.
See you next time.
See you.